Hey, welcome back. We're going to continue on with ideas about philosophy and complexity theory, and I want to delve into ideas around new materialism and assemblage theory. So we touched on this a little bit in the last part of this input. We're going to take a look at two key figures. I like to refer to them as two of my D majors, Gilles Deleuze and Manuel Delanda, and my third D major is Albrecht Dürer. So I feel like these three characters for me really summarize ways of thinking in a complexity lens. Deleuze is a French philosopher. He died in 1995, and his works have really been in the process of being translated into the English. It took a while for that to happen, so it's only in the last decade or two that the works have started to become more popular, but they've been very, very influential, and also very influential in architecture. And Manuel Delanda is a philosopher who sort of unpacks a lot of Deleuzian work, and he also works with architects and lectures in architecture schools, and is very interested in some of the implications of complexity science, Deleuzian philosophy, and architectural spatial development. He really sort of built this idea of new materialism, and this gets back to this idea that we were left off with, that things can kind of be I've got to slow down my speaking so that I'm clear, that things can enter into interactions with one another, and that those then have agency. All right, so this phrase came up in the last lecture. I'm just going to repeat it. The idea of difference and repetition. So we have the individual things that manifest as different, and then we have the sort of things that we see repeating, and those sort of tell us something about the underlying mechanism or pattern. So one way of framing this is something that Deleuze and Delanda refer to as population thinking. And just to be clear, Deleuze and Delanda are some of the really key philosophers who tie this back to complexity theory. Deleuze alludes to notions of complexity theory a fair amount, and then Delanda makes those allusions much more specific and particular. Okay, so population thinking is really tying in this notion of difference and repetition. So we don't think about objects anymore, we talk about populations, where the same phase space or virtual space can manifest as a host of different actualized spaces. Here's where the language gets messy, because the critical realists use one set of terminology, but then Deleuze and Delanda use a different set of terminology. But they're really talking about the same ideas, this idea of the kind of those mechanisms behind the space of all possibilities. So we have the population, the space of possibilities of all possible skeletal structures, right? And then the way in which these are actualized, that's defined by relations of intensity. So when I talk about differentiation, they can also talk about intensities, which is like how are we moving those parameter bars. So population identities, the identity of a particular face, of a particular fish, of a particular spot pattern, right? These manifest according to differences of how we're just sliding those parameter bars. Those are the intensities. And those intensities could relate to all kinds of things: temperature, pressure, tension, reproduction rate, et cetera, et cetera. But that is kind of parametricized ontology, because we can slide parameters and then we can draw out all of these different manifestations from this kind of underlying, almost like field of opportunities. Form emerges from the continuous variability of matter rather than being imposed on it by an external agency. This is the morphogenetic model. So rather than us imposing form, we sort of draw it out. And this is why we're trying to think about this sort of differential machines, where we draw out different kinds of formal capacities by varying some kind of intensity. And of course, we could vary those things randomly. When we get into real complex systems, those intensities, they matter. They are about the environment. They're about how the environment is creating a difference that then that potentiality has to respond to. Again, this idea that I mentioned, that for me, difference is everything. So there's intensive differentiation. And this is a language for talking about concrete physical processes whereby an undifferentiated intensive space, that is a space defined by continuous properties that are not divisible, So think about the space of all those parameter bars, right? And just what all those fields are, that it progressively differentiates, eventually giving rise to extensive structures, discontinuous structures with defined or definite metric properties. So when we see an actual definite metric property of a soap bubble that is a particular space and moment in time, it's just because it has the underlying mechanisms have progressively differentiated. I fear I may be over repeating myself, but I want you to understand where some of this terminology is coming from. And also when you go to the readings and you're reading all these terms, I want you to feel like you've been exposed to them in a few different ways. Delanda aligns himself with critical realism, so he's talking about things similar to critical realism, but he's much, much more specific in terms of how he relates it to complexity. So Deleuze talks about this idea of the difference or différence or the differential. And this is less about individual actualizations and more about the virtual space of all potentiality, the space of all possible trees, skulls, etc. So the differential is kind of like the thing that is lying underneath all of these sort of different possibilities, or the differential is like the sliding of these parameters that activate something. And because this is important, the notion of difference is so important and central to Deleuze, he says we have to move from thinking about objects, these really concrete, to, objectiles, right, that are differentials that happen to be made physical. This represents a shift from molding, how do we mold things, to how do we modulate things, from a form imposing mode to a self-regulating mode. And that self-regulating mode can be in some kind of dialogue with the environment. Again, you can think about the cybernetic model we talked about, that self-regulation where you're getting too far away, you're getting off track, so you steer the ship and you activate the ship's potential differences by steering more closely towards that shoreline that you're heading towards. And this is what we want to sort of be investigating when we design this sort of morphogenetic instrument, is this idea of making differentials physical rather than focusing on making physical things or molding. Okay, so next piece, this idea of assemblage and new materialism. So there's this piece around difference and repetition, and then there's this piece around assemblage and new materialism. So assemblage, this is a notion again brought forward by Deleuze. It's a translation of a French word, agencement, that doesn't translate easily into English. It refers both to, the term agencement refers both to agency and arrangement. So how things are assembled, how they are arranged, but also the fact that then once they are arranged, they have a kind of a power and agency. Again, like the assemblage of me working with my computer, this imbrication, this locking in, this flat ontology between things. So assemblage theory considers places, things, entities, etc., all as these kinds of contingent assemblages. They come together and they hold emergent properties that are not reducible to its parts. So me and my computer working together, we're something bigger than the computer on its own or me on my own. We have emergent new properties that appear. And you cannot reduce these things to the parts. But at the same time, I mean, I can step away from the computer and enter into a different kind of assemblage. I'm not locked into it, but when I'm with it, I have different kinds of powers. You can think about you and your assemblage with your cell phone and how much you feel locked in with that. Entities have capacities that are activated differentially according to arrangements that are entered into. So if I'm an entity somehow, right, and I enter into an assemblage with a bike, I have new kinds of capacities that I now can exert. But when I get off the bike and I enter into an assemblage with something else, with a pair of skis, believe me, I don't have very good agentic powers there. I probably am just going to stand frozen still, fearful. The example that Delanda gives when talking about this idea of new capacities is the example of bringing together in the Mongolian steppes, the warrior, the horse, and the stirrup. So each of these things have independent intrinsic capacities. Of course, has got some intrinsic capacities, as do with the other pieces. But when you bind these things together, when they enter into an imbrication, they have new emergent capacities that are realized because they've entered into a new assemblage, they've entered into new relations with one another. And these new emergent capacities cannot be reduced to any of the one individual components. We now have this new agentic piece, right? The warrior plus horse plus stirrup, that pays attention to both the entities in and of themselves and the capacities that they possess, as well as how these capacities are differentially activated in various arrangements or agencements, various assemblages. So what does this mean? When we put these things together, and Deleuze sometimes talks about this as a machinic assemblage, we now have the warrior, stirrup, and horse, and this turns into a fighting machine, right? That it was able to sort of conquer swaths of Asia because there were new capacities that were given to this machinic assemblage. The entity was more than the sum of its parts. And this becomes a stabilized entity, you know, it holds together and takes on agency. So for assemblage and for critical realism, the world out there that we see is constructed as institutions and networks come together and assemble. But what we see, this particular world is contingent. It's history, history matters, and things could have manifested or come together differently. Further, assemblages have identities that can persist, and Deleuze talks about this as when they are persisting, when they're holding together, they're territorialized, or they can loosen back into constituent parts, which is called deterritorialization. So it's not like once you're bound together, you're forever there. And it's also not like you totally lose yourself when you enter into assemblages, because the parts in turn can enter into new assemblages that activate new agentic powers. So we have to be able to talk about the parts and the whole, but how parts also don't become, you know, captured within the whole. They can move off and do their own thing as parts. But when they're acting as a part of a different assemblage, different things are going to be drawn out, different potentialities. It's like different parts of that phase space, those parameter bars are activated differently. A critical realist perspective considers not only the actual, what manifests, but also the virtual, what exists but has not yet or may never, in fact, manifest. So, and in this way, it sort of aligns with this notion that Deleuze talks about of the virtual that might have capacities that are able to manifest. So another example of this, back to bubbles, what are activated capacities? So you have, you know, breath, which activates a soap solution, and then we get soap bubbles, right, which is a capacity that is activated in the soap that isn't obvious when it's sitting there in a bottle, nor is it obvious that a breath has the capacity to generate a form, right? But you put these two things together and you have new sort of activated capacities. And then an activated capacity of the bubble will be the opportunity to give joy to little children as they play in the bubbles, right? So that's a new agentic possibility that the bubble has that's independent of the soap solution. A soap solution isn't a heck of a lot of fun for a little kid, but bubbles are a lot of fun. So we can't reduce that whole to the sum of its parts. Neither is blowing particularly fun either, right? But I mean, you put these things together, they have new agency. The other thing, just as a side note, is that the spherical shape of that soap bubble is kind of an attractor that exists prior to the bubble. So that the bubble, even though it has a lot of different kinds of capacities, it will tend towards this particular manifestation. And this gets into this idea of what are material tendencies, that some capacities are easier to activate than others. So we could potentially get this really stretched bubble. Maybe if we, you know, you see people running with these bubble makers and they get these super long bubbles, right? But, you know, to get that, you have to run, you have to put a lot of energy into the system. That is a tendency you can activate, but it's more difficult to activate. So deterritorialized entities have properties, right? All potential aspects of an entity. So, you know, when you see a soap solution sitting there, it's got a bunch of properties. Then they also have capacities that might be activated when they enter into different assemblages, when they enter into relations with other things. And suddenly, well, this solution of soap, it had the capacity to be fun and bubble-like, right? But it needed to enter into a relation in order for that to occur. And it also has tendencies, so propensities for certain aspects to be activated. So let's think about this, moving away from bubbles as much as I love them. Let's think about this in terms of a hammer, right? So I have a hammer. A hammer has certain properties, right? It has a certain shape, etc., certain weight to it. And then I can, it has some capacities, which means that I can use it to hammer a nail, and that's one capacity. But I could also use it to, hit you over the head, and that would be another capacity that I could activate. I could use it as a weapon to kill you, but I won't. But the question is, like, we could also use the hammer as a paperweight to hold down paper. So it has the capacity to be activated, for its properties to be used, for its property of weight to be used as either as a weapon or as a tool to hold down my papers from blowing away in the wind when I'm sitting outside because of COVID-19. But there are things that tend to be activated more, propensities. So you tend to use a hammer to nail, right? Same thing when we were talking about a chair. We could have a child that sits on the floor and uses the chair as a table. So that child is sort of pulling out the capacity for the chair to become a table, but that is not the chair's tendency to be occupied that way. In addition, there are singularities, or moments when tendencies of the system will shift. And we can think about a singularity as, for example, if we think of water, water can manifest its material tendencies in the form of ice, vapor, or liquid, right? Solid vapor or liquid. And so there's moments as we're sliding these parameters, as we're shifting the information, differentiating the information, when it will move to a different attractor state, a different tendency will emerge. Okay. So because materials have all of these kind of really interesting capacities, Delanda wants to sort of bring life or vital matter back into things. And so there's been kind of this movement in thinking in architectural theory recently that really is talking about how matter matters, right? And this considers material capacities or tendencies that might be activated. And it becomes less about thinking about what a material might look like and mean, and how materials can portray meaning or signify things, and more with what a building might participate in acting, where the building becomes an actant or an agent. This is considered a post-human perspective, and which is exactly what it sounds like, right? We're moving away from being centered on the human as the only thing that can make things happen, and more thinking, no, we can move beyond it and think about material things as also having power, having force, having agency, where there's this imbrication, this intertwining of both human and non-human, this dance of agency. So the bottom line of this is that material becomes not just dead stuff that we shape, but a material that actually is somehow engaged, that participates in shaping us and its own shaping. At the same time, this material participation in shaping us is not like environmental determinism, where we're just controlled by our environment. We always have these kind of ways to escape from that particular assemblage, but we sort of enter into assemblages with material environments in ways that they are actually participating, helping us along, steering us in particular ways, and that we want to recognize how matter can do that to us. Design implications. How might we consider the components of the built environment in ways that they are a constituent part of productive assemblages? Not just stuff we act on, but stuff that sort of pulls out stuff from us and has agency. In the same way that the computer or the pen pulls out different possibilities out of me, activates new capacities in me, are there ways in which the material environment can activate new possibilities, new behaviors, things I never would have thought of, but the material environment somehow prompts me, encourages me? This is one implication. In what ways might we design environments so as to activate more material possibilities? So maybe I need one set of material possibilities, but you need a different set. Are there ways in which you can enter into a particular assemblage with a built environment that's different from mine? Not a one-size-fits-all. Remember we talked about normative stuff and Gaussian curves and the bell curve and then the power law distribution of niches, right? Could there be material environments that kind of afford this broader spectrum of possibilities. And depending on how I sort of engage with the environment, I'm sort of pulling out different material capacities. How might we rethink the built conditions that allow for the emergence of the new? This is from the article by Marenko that I have posted on the website for you to look at. All right, thanks so much.